This whole thing is a total joke. Number one, there is no state of Palestine. There's nothing that has defined borders, a defined population, a government that carries out the normal functions of government. The predecessor to the Palestinian Authority, the Palestine Liberation Organization, started this charade back in 1989 when they tried to join the World Health Organization, were defeated in that vote because the United States basically said under the George H.W. Bush administration, if the UN considers Palestine, quote unquote, a state, the United States will cut off all contributions to that organization.
Yeah,
So if this vote continues, there will be no U.S. funding for the UN, and I hope people take that into account.
but you know,
The
if we're still
charter, let me just finish here.
okay,
The charter of the United Nations says that the General Assembly shall consider recommendations for membership from the Security Council. The PLO, the Palestine Authority, call it what you will, are trying to jam the Security Council here. I have no doubt even the Biden administration will veto this. This is hurting whatever efforts may be still underway to try and bring peace back to the region. It's
okay.
pure UN politics. It is a joke.
Well, you've made that very clear. But nevertheless, if there is still a commitment, and there is from many countries, to a two-state solution, surely Palestinian statehood is a precursor to that. And, you know, David Cameron, our own Foreign Secretary in the UK, has talked up UK recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations. So, you know, it's
What
not
what are the
that
boundaries of the
outlandish to
Palestinian state? What are the boundaries?
no, I appreciate there are many, many hurdles to be resolved. But I mean, you talk about it as a joke, but two-state solution is still the only game in town at some point in the future,
Well,
isn't it?
I don't think that, but even let's just assume that is the only game in town. You don't win statehood in the corridors of the United Nations. It's the Palestinian state, if it's ever going to exist, has to be through negotiation with Israel and the other partners involved, like Egypt, like Jordan. This, as I say, this is a ploy that goes back almost 35 years to try and create facts in the UN when facts on the ground don't exist.
It sounds as if
And
you've entirely lost patience with the UN.
look, I was in Geneva in the spring of 1989 when the PLO tried this trick the first time, and I'm happy to say that the U.S. led the charge to defeat it. They're back at it now. They've got a very weak administration in Joe Biden. Maybe they think they can slide this thing through. But I tell you, there's already outrage on the Republican side in the House and the Senate. You haven't seen the end of consequences for this yet. You know, people want to play games at the UN. You wonder why the U.S. population as a whole is skeptical of the UN. You're seeing a case study right here of why that is.
Okay, you're talking about games, you talk about a joke, but the supporters of this proposal say this is merely a sort of act of solidarity for an oppressed people. What do you say to that?
I couldn't care less about an act of solidarity for any people when you're just violating the fundamental precepts of the UN Charter that they're supposed to revere. The only qualifications to be a UN member is you have to be a peace loving state. There's no state and they're not peace loving. What else could go wrong?
Well, talking of peace, what's your assessment of where we stand on the ceasefire and the US clearly under Joe Biden losing patience with Israel now?
Well, I hope Israel goes ahead and goes into Rafah. I think their only recourse is to crush Hamas, to eliminate its political and military capabilities. I think, in fact, they've waited too long. And I think now is the time to act.
Israeli military has ordered the evacuation of tens of thousands more Palestinians from Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip. Residents of eastern districts of the city were told to go to Al Mawasi, a narrow coastal area which Israel has declared to be a humanitarian zone. Now, the Israeli military says that about 300,000 Palestinians have moved there since they began telling people to leave Rafah. On Friday, the UN General Assembly has overwhelmingly voted to support a Palestinian bid to become a full UN member by recognising it as qualified to join. The Israeli representative accused diplomats of being Jew-hating. Well, let's chew through this with Jonathan Conricus, who is former spokesperson for the Israeli Defence Forces. Jonathan, good afternoon. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Now, the full-scale invasion of Rafah hasn't been launched yet. but people are really worried about the situation. They're saying it's a dire situation. There are very few routes out of Rafah. Where do you think Palestinian people are meant to go in this situation?
Yeah, speaking about people, and I will definitely address the situation for Palestinians. Actually, the people that I would want to start speaking about are Israeli people that for the last 7 months have been forced out of their homes around the Gaza Strip, have been killed or taken abducted by Hamas, and are still waiting for the return of safety so that they can come back to their homes. And I'm referring to Israelis, not to Palestinians. And I know that a lot of the global attention goes towards the plight of Palestinians, many of whom, by the way, supported Hamas in their atrocities on October the 7th. Now, having said that, what Israel is doing now is carrying on with what it said actually from day one that it will do, and that is to go in and to dismantle each and every part of Hamas's infrastructure in order to make sure that Hamas will never ever be able to launch an attack like October the 7th again on Israel. And what we're seeing now is an advance. We're not seeing the all-out attack yet. This is still, I would say, local, and it's a gradual response or a gradual approachment. We're not seeing the main areas of Rafah city being asked to evacuate yet, but what we are seeing is more neighborhoods where the IDF is telling civilians, please evacuate. If you want to ensure the safety of you and your families, then we urge you to evacuate. That will greatly increase your chances of living. And if you stay, you are being used as human shields by Hamas.
Let's put into perspective what he said. Israel's not facing an existential threat from Hamas in Gaza. It's ridiculous to paint Hamas as an existential threat to Israel. Israel has destroyed much of Hamas's ability to threaten Israel, to govern the Gaza Strip, and Hamas was never an existential threat to Israel. So that's not the issue here.
But wouldn't you say, Gershon, sorry to interrupt you, but one of Hamas's edicts is the destruction of the state of Israel. So
okay, that's true. Hamas has been dedicated to the destruction of Israel, and they did commit atrocities on October 7th. There's no question about it. But the reason why they were able to commit those atrocities is because the government of Israel failed to deploy the army to protect the people of Israel. If there had been a dozen tanks and 2 or 3 assault helicopters in the air at the time in the morning of October 7th, October 7th would have never happened. It was Israel's failure to protect itself that led to the horrendous results of the atrocities committed by Hamas. Now Israel wants to attack the 20% of the Gaza Strip that it hasn't attacked yet, between the cities of Khan Yunis and Rafah. There are about 1.5 million Palestinians there. It will be catastrophic if Israel attacks that area, and the United States has a duty to ensure that the weapons that it supplies to Israel are not being used to kill innocent civilians, which they have done until now.
How much of a tough spot is the Prime Minister Netanyahu in? From what I understand, he has a lot of pressure from the right wing of his party. They could threaten with pulling out of his coalition, therefore forcing elections. That could have a knock-on effect of him being voted out of office. And the knock-on effect of that would be that he might have to face trials on accusations of criminality and corruption cases against him. If, on the other hand, he maintains this defiance and standing alone, he risks upsetting one of Israel's biggest allies, the United States. How do you see his position?
First of all, he is already standing trial for corruption. He was indicted more than 2 years ago, and his trials are continuing. Even as the war continues, he's on trial for corruption. Secondly, Netanyahu has lost popularity with the people of Israel because he was the man in charge of Israel on the day that Hamas crossed the border, breached the border, and committed those atrocities. Now, it wasn't just October 7th that was the problem, is that Netanyahu has fostered a strategy and implemented a strategy since 2009 that removed the Palestinian issue from the agenda of Israel. He convinced the Israeli people and the world that this conflict could be managed, that we can make peace with our other neighbors without dealing with the Palestinian people, that we can continue to occupy them now for 57 years and expect to have peace. And this blew up in our face on October 7th. So more than 2/3 of the Israeli public want us to go to elections in 2024. He's lost more than half of his base. The problem is that the majority of Israelis believe that we should only go to elections once the war is over. And that's one of the reasons why Netanyahu has no intention of ending the war, because he will be voted out of office, and he doesn't want that to happen.
As a former Israeli peace negotiator, do you have any idea of what's happening behind the scenes at the moment? Because, of course, we mustn't forget, and I know the streets of Tel Aviv every weekend are filled with people who are reminding the government of the hostages. We must not forget that there are still hostages kept by Hamas in Gaza. Are there communications using back channels? What usually happens at this stage of the negotiations for the hostages?
There are 132 hostages still in Gaza. It's estimated that a large number of them are no longer alive. Israel tells us that the military pressure will free them. What we know in the last 7 months is that the military pressure has just killed more and more hostages. There have been negotiations going on between Israel and Hamas through Qatar and Egypt, with a very big assistance from the United States. Those talks have broken down. It seems to me that at this moment, the gaps between the two sides are not bridgeable. Hamas will not agree to a deal with Israel that does not include the end of the war, and Israel will not make a deal with Hamas that includes the end of the war. And therefore, the talks have broken down. The parties have gone back home. The mediators have gone back home. The head of the CIA, who was in Cairo for the talks, went back to Washington, and they're stuck. The Hamas did agree to use a secret direct back channel, and the Israelis rejected that possibility. This is one of the problems here, that we have no direct communication between the two parties. It's also a very bizarre negotiation because both parties are dedicated to killing each other. So it's very difficult to have a kind of a negotiation at this time. But Israel must get the hostages home. Every day they're in Gaza is too long. It's already been more than 7 months. And we're talking about still some children, women, elderly people, wounded and sick people. This is just a horrendous humanitarian situation. They're not allowed visits by the International Red Cross. They don't receive medication. We don't know where they are, their well-being. We don't know how many of them are alive. And this is just an intolerable situation that the international community should be outraged about.
Do you think the Israeli government has abandoned the hostages?
I think that the Israeli government has put the war efforts as their first priority and bringing the hostages home as the second priority. The two goals of the war, of defeating Hamas entirely and bringing the hostages home, are not compatible.
The IDF is now performing two offensive at the same time, moving westward into Rafah and also returning to the Jabalia neighborhood near Gaza City at the same time. That's actually where on Friday, 5 IDF soldiers were killed, but the fifth was just announced. Now the total number of soldiers who have been killed in Gaza, 272. The level of airstrike activity in the Jabalia neighborhood yesterday, as I'm following two women posting from Gaza, they described over 100 airstrikes taking place. The IDF says at this point over 50 have been killed in the Rafah area. What is more remarkable about this is because it's resembling some of the storylines that we followed in November and December early on. A lot of stories coming out of engagement taking place near tunnel entrances or around civilian homes, schools, and that because the IDF told the civilian population to come into Rafah, they never worked to dismantle the tunnel network by air. So they're communicating, and some of the videos also are showing that the tunnel network is still intact in the Rafah area. One of the other things they said, which I had mentioned yesterday as well, but I think it's worth repeating, that the IDF has communicated, the Israeli establishment, I should say, has communicated that we're going into Rafah because that's where Sinwar is. The leader of Hamas is there. And yesterday, two high-level officials quoted in the Times of Israel saying, Sinwar's moved. He's no longer in Rafah. He's moved to Khan Yunis. That's probably something that would happen if possible through the tunnel network. There's connectivity over that distance. But it is one of the questions that comes out of this is just where is the Israeli strategy behind going forward with these campaigns if you know that Hamas is going to, fighters on the ground are going to engage, sure, but probably a healthy majority of them are going to move with the civilian population, probably move with their families and go into the refugee areas and escape the fighting once again. And Sinwar is going to move through the tunnel network and go to wherever the fighting is least intense. They have that capability. So no answer directly to what the Israeli strategy here is. They haven't spoken publicly about how they see an end to this conflict, how they see a complete defeat of Hamas, other than they go into Rafah, they engage the 4 remaining Hamas battalions that they're calling them, and that supposedly that will bring an end to the war. But we're already starting to see over the last few days, the level of fighting that is taking place is showing that Hamas's strength 6 months on is still capable of this level of engagement. They're still capable of firing rockets on Israeli cities. Beersheba and Ashkelon have been under rocket attacks for the first time in months. And everyone here in Israel thought those rocket attacks had all been ended because of such a heavy emphasis at the beginning of the war at targeting those rocket launch facilities or basically underground rocket launch posts. We're 7 months in, and Hamas still capable of waging war at this level.
His most immediate threat is not coming from Joe Biden, certainly not from Lord Cameron, who he doesn't really rate very highly, but it's coming from his own political partners, those who control his fate, the far-right parties in his coalition. They're the ones who are demanding from him, and they've made also red lines that if Israel doesn't go in deep into Rafah and take the fight there to Hamas, they're threatening to leave his coalition to bring down his government. So first of all, he's talking to them. The preparations for the operation, Netanyahu's tough rhetoric is all designed to try and keep them in the coalition. That's his main concern. And that doesn't mean that he's going to send the entire divisions of the Israel Defense Forces into Rafah in days. He'll probably have a lot to listen to from the Americans and try and somehow find a way not to anger Joe Biden too much. But like I said, right now he's mainly playing for time.
And is it possible that there could be some kind of breakthrough involving the return of hostages that might stay his hand, or is he going to do this come what may at some point?
Well, that's the question that everyone's asking themselves also in Netanyahu's own war cabinet. That currently the proposals that have been made by the Egyptians with the American backing, they're actually 2 different proposals. There's a proposal or a response to a proposal by Hamas, and there's what Israel has already agreed to, and there's still quite a few discrepancies between them, which are critical. The question is, can they be bridged? Now, the more pragmatic part of the war cabinet is in favor of such a deal if those differences can be bridged. The Americans certainly are, and the Americans, at least in public, are putting the blame on Hamas for not for putting up too tough conditions to the deal. So the possibility is still there. But even if the working level teams that Israel has sent to Cairo will probably send again in 2 or 3 days, reach some kind of a compromise with the Egyptians and the Americans and Hamas, there still is the political obstacle back in Israel where Netanyahu has to face down the far right. So even if there is a deal on the table, and we're not quite there yet, there still are quite a few hurdles for that to pass.
And what's your assessment of the likelihood of a significant number of the hostages which are still held coming back alive?
Well, there are currently 132 hostages, believed at least to be in Gaza, who have been held there now for 220 days. Of them, around, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 38 have already been officially presumed dead by Israel. So those are bodies now, hostages. And Israeli intelligence believes that there are at least a couple of dozen more. So we're talking here in the region of 60 or 70 live hostages still being held, and they are now at the center of these negotiations. There are two groups of them. One group are women, perhaps some remaining children, old people, and the sick, and they're assessed to be about 33 hostages of that category. And then there are soldiers and relatively young men who even if they're not soldiers, Hamas treats as soldiers, and they will probably be at the next stage of any kind of negotiations. But right now, the 33 hostages, that's the number that they're talking about. And the question is, can the conditions for their release be met? And that's what we're going to see from the end of this week, because this is a week in Israel with Memorial Day and Independence Day. So I don't think there's going to be any serious talks until at least Wednesday or Thursday.
We're working with international partners in order to get aid into Gaza. And I can say even this morning, we've conducted humanitarian operations with the World Food Programme, bringing truckloads of food supplies into northern Gaza Strip. So absolutely, we're listening attentively to our allies, and it is part of the war effort. Our war effort is currently focused on two core issues. First of all, preventing Hamas from regrouping, and that is precisely what you mentioned there. The operations being conducted this morning in the area of Jabalia, as well as in the area of Zaytun, are areas where we've identified that Hamas is trying to regroup and reorganize and conduct further offensives against Israel. That's something we can't allow. We can't allow Hamas to continue to threaten Israel. And the second component, of course, is the limited in scope operations that we're currently conducting in the eastern parts of Rafah. I can say that we've been successful so far in dismantling and destroying tunnel shafts that we found, which would be used by the terrorists. And on the second hand, also engaging the enemy on the ground. We've done this, mind you, only after we've conducted an extremely extensive evacuation plan to get people out of harm's way. Some 300,000 people have left the area after we called on them because we wanted to get them out of the war zone.
But both your allies in the UK and the US and many more have said that they don't support your actions in Rafah. So why are you proceeding with them?
So we have to keep in mind what the alternatives are. And I think what is most important is that you wouldn't allow Hamas to be your neighbor with the opportunity just to come into your backyard, abduct children, kill women and men. And this is the alternative. We have to fight Hamas. We have to make sure that they don't have the powers to conduct the atrocities of the 7th of October ever again. They've promised that if they are given the chance to do so, they will. So we are in an effort to dismantle Hamas as a governing authority and bring home the hostages. There are 132 Israelis still being held by Hamas in unbearable conditions. We know about the stories coming out of hostages that have been released or rescued about those conditions. We need to bring home the hostages, and we need to make sure that Hamas never have the power to do what they did ever again.